I could spend the full 30 minutes just acknowledging, thanking a lot of people. I won't, but some that I must. First of all, the selection committee for the award. It's flattering to be considered. It's an honor to be selected, so thank you very much. I've been on the other end of that call, making the call to our award winners, and it's a tremendous amount of fun making the call. I can now say it's a lot of fun being on the receiving end of the call as well, so I appreciate that. Steve and Janet for hosting, Luann and myself, office staff for making the travel possible. All of you for being here, especially those of you that have traveled a long distance from elsewhere. I appreciate you doing that. It's nice to talk to a full room. I want to acknowledge the namesake of the award, John Osmun, for his many contributions to entomology and to this department. And acknowledge Liz O'Neill for Friendship Forever and my bride Luann for putting up with and supporting my ideas for the last 30 years. So thanks for that. And that actually started here in West Lafayette that many years back. Well, there are two negatives about having a Doctor of Philosophy degree. The first of those is believing that you can philosophize, and the second is believing that other people want to hear it. And so I'm going to demonstrate both of those negatives here this afternoon. So in starting, okay, I'm going to talk about ideas. This is a data-free talk, so you can put down your pencils. Where do ideas come from? How do they form? How do they develop? How do they mature? As I developed this talk, I was really influenced by three things. First of all, a book published 2 years ago, Stephen Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From. The second, this being a year of anniversaries of important ideas, and I'm going to come back to both of those. And the third was really thinking about how ideas are connected. What is the thread that runs through them? And it's going to start with a silly little story, and that was I was sitting at the breakfast table looking out the window at our bird feeder. It's a daily ritual, and it starts early in the morning, and our cat was sitting beside me looking out the window. It's also her daily ritual. And I started thinking about our cat. She's all black, except she's got one patch of white. And I remembered my daughter telling me that black cats are the hardest to get adopted. Unless they have some white on them, then they're more likely to be adopted. And then I remembered a story, it was in a documentary, about a cat that was valued simply because it was spotted with white. And it was the cat and its owners lived in New Mexico in the 1940s near the Trinity nuclear test site. And when the bomb was tested, they were downwind of the test site, and radioactive particles fell on this cat, burned the fur, exposing the white skin underneath, and so they had a black cat that was all dotted white. And someone came by and offered this family $5 for this white spotted cat, which in 1943 was a lot of money, 44, for an otherwise not very valuable cat. Well, that had me thinking about nuclear testing and then nuclear weapons in general, and those countries that would want to have nuclear weapons. And then I started thinking about Iran and the concern about a nuclear program in Iran, and that moved to the separation of Iran from many other Middle Eastern countries, and then the idea of prospects for peace in the Middle East and the failure of those policies. So why do I do that? I try to, well, you do this probably unconsciously or consciously. You get to some idea and you think, how on earth did I get here? And so I like tracing ideas backward to see how did I get to that point. So in this case, tracing backward, I go from nuclear weapons in Iran to testing to a black cat to my bird feeder outside the back window. And so I do this went through this story just to show that ideas have origins and connections, and I'm going to call that a phylogeny, and that ideas develop and mature, and they get expressed in a certain context, or they have an ontogeny. And I'm using the definitions of phylogeny and ontogeny shown here, and I'm also going to use the term exaptation, which I believe was first coined by Stephen Jay Gould and Sarah Verba in a publication a number of years ago. But I think that all of these terms can be used to or applied to the development and maturation of ideas or research directions. I'm sorry, I was supposed to turn the lights down. Are we okay? Okay. And applying those ideas in areas for which they were not originally developed. Well, I'm going to use this metaphor of phylogeny and ontogeny, and it may not be perfect, but in order to explore these ideas and research direction, we'll see whether it works. And I also think that we can think about ideas and how that can apply to the philosophy of education and graduate education, and I'm going to use my education here as an example. So today and this year, we celebrate the Centennial of the Purdue Department of Entomology, but that was just one of several key anniversaries of ideas. We've got the Morrill Act, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, July 2nd, 1862. Justin Smith Morrill's Landmark Act was an idea that did not spring up as an aha moment. It didn't just happen on its own, but it was influenced by his seeing a need for practical education and recognizing that that didn't occur in university education at the time. So his idea of granting land to generate money to support education did not originate with him, but it did mature with him, and he put it into action. When he originally introduced the act in 1859, it was vetoed, and this was at a time that states' rights were increasing, the interest in federal control was waning, and Morrill waited until the political winds shifted, which they did after the southern states seceded, and then there was interest in unity of the remaining states, and that allowed the Act's passage. And that Act really enabled an education that was accessible to all, an education that paralleled the entrepreneurial spirit and the practical development of our country, and it developed an educated class of society. But it wasn't an isolated idea. 25 years later, the Hatch Act, same thing, no aha moment. This was an act that gave funds to create ag experiment stations, the mechanism for public funding of agricultural research. And that public funding made possible improvements in food, fiber, and beyond, making possible feeding the world, improving or providing new prosperity and a new global agroeconomy, which really, these are directions that help define who we are and what we do today. But along with creating practical education through the land-grant schools, the research improvement in agriculture allowed rural families to prosper and to send their children to college. Those children generated new knowledge, which led to improved agriculture, which further enhanced the importance of agricultural education. So you had a couple of ideas connected together that created this cycle of positive feedback. And we then come to Purdue Entomology, beginning in 1912, enabled by and connected to both the Morrill and Hatch Acts. Now, I'm not going to belabor the history of the department. You have a whole year to go through that, but I do want to ask yourself, why here? Why then? How was this department envisioned? And what was the genesis and growth of that idea? And then how did that idea and the vision mature over the next century in the often competing contexts of culture, science, and academia. Because these three historical events, I would say, represent ideas, but again, not isolated ideas. Each was a collection of linked ideas, finding light at key times in an appropriate historical context. There were key junctures in the history of this department that led to new directions, based on key people with great ideas, but also a range of people having different perspectives, different ideas, and different ideals. Clearly, many of the ideas and ideals are associated with John Osmun. Among his many contributions, his vision for a strong scientific and educational basis for structural pest control really was an important point that helped define this department. It was the right idea at the right time. But there's also one more anniversary that is connected to this department, and that is that 50 years ago, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. And that created an awareness of the connections in our environment, which led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, to which John provided a great amount of contribution and impact, and above all, his professionalism contributed there. Well, I said I wasn't going to belabor the history of the department, then I did that. So I mentioned, I'll move on, I mentioned being influenced by Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. And there were a couple of points in there that I thought were important. The importance of slow hunches, connections and connectedness, serendipity and error. And the fact that these factors operate at multiple levels, from the individual, whether we're talking about a faculty member or a grad student, to a collection of people, such as this department. A scientist has a hunch, and that's based on a history of ideas and findings, and I'm going to say that's really a phylogenetic background. That hunch then has a way of developing and changing. Its ontogeny is how I'll use that. As the hunch matures over time, gains strength, or even changes direction through a variety of connections. Ideas benefit from serendipity, right place at the right time, also finding something when we weren't even looking for or expecting it. And ideas benefit from error, mistakes in how we think. I'm not talking about sloppiness in what we do, but errors in how we think that allow us to be wrong, but also to benefit from that error. And I'm going to use these concepts of phylogeny and ontogeny to illustrate ideas, their generation, maturation, development, and connections. And I'm going to try this metaphor, or to apply this metaphor, by illustrating some key points and radiation of ideas in my own career. So those of you that are systematists in the room, I'm not a systematist, and so I hope I don't abuse too many laws of phylogenetics or cladistics, but I probably will. But forgive my misuse of some of the terms. But I'm going to start first by creating my lineage, which, as Steve said, was avian behavior when I worked on a project with Carrie Ravenold in biology here at Purdue. So that is establishing my outgroup, if you will. And the first branching point came when I moved across the street, literally to this side of the street, to entomology. You know that I worked with Bob O'Neill, but what you may not know is how important Bob was to the generation of ideas with me and to allow my ideas to mature. And that integral influence was not just during my time here, but throughout my career. So as my project developed, then there were several branching points. The clade that led to working with predators in crops also include work on carabids. And later this developed into a project with working with Cliff and with Bob on master gardener research and outreach. And in my dissertation project, I worked on the biology of predatory Heteroptera. And first I had a false start trying to work with navids, And then when that didn't work, shifted to working with pedesis, as Steve told you. What I worked on with Bob, we studied searching behavior, created a model to describe predator searching, and we studied predator life history and how facultatively predaceous or phytophagous predators could persist in crop habitats. Well, underlying all of these nodes in radiation was an application of ecology and modeling that were two of Bob's major strengths to the biological control of insects in crops. And I would say what I gained at Purdue as a grad student and as a graduate was not how a predatory stink bug controlled a pest in soybeans. Instead, what I gained was a body of ideas on insect ecology, modeling, physiology, and life history, and how those factors would underlie and be necessary to understand and apply to biological control. And I believe I gained the connections among that body of ideas. As Steve said, I moved to Texas A&M, where the knowledge that I gained here was applied in a totally new setting, and I'm going to say that's an acceptation. I moved from generalist predatory stink bugs adapted to living in an ephemeral soybean habitat to working on a specialist introduced braconid parasitoid, Cotesia flavipes, that attacks stem-boring Lepidoptera in a totally different kind of crop habitat, that of grass crops, sugarcane, corn, etc. And in that clade were some of the same directions, searching behavior and sampling. I started thinking about the ephemerality of habitats. Oh, that didn't work. Oh well. And how biological control could be improved in ephemeral crop habitats. I worked on novel associations for biological control, and that required studying the behavioral and chemical ecology of Cotesia flavipes and how that could be applied in this setting. It also required studying the physiology of host-parasitoid relationships and the immune response, the specificity of parasitoids, the immune response of the host, and the parasitoid counter responses. And along the way, as this whole line of thought developed, this slow hunch of how to implement biological control in crop systems matured slowly, but through understanding how the parasitoid and the host function in that crop habitat. As you heard, I moved to Illinois, where I continued on the work with the immune response, physiology, host specificity, behavior, and chemical ecology with Cotesia flavipes. But the real branch point, I would say, came when Dave Oatland here in the audience, the serendipitous opportunity with Dave on a project on biological control of purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria, using chrysomelids in the genus Scaloricella. When I started, I didn't know anything about herbivores, didn't know anything about plant ecology, and very little about wetlands. So I would say that the acceptation that made that possible was really my background in the principles of ecology and life history applied to biological control. And once beginning on this project, there was what I would call rapid radiation, studying diapause, which was necessary to rear the beetles. Host specificity, which we needed to know in order to assure the safety of the agents. We had, as Steve mentioned, education and outreach about biological control, training educators and classroom teachers. Learning about wetlands, especially how they were affected by invasive plants, invasive weeds. And I even returned to an ancestral type with a project on the effects of purple loosestrife on nesting wetland birds. Convergent evolution, if you happen to be following me. Invasion biology and invasive species, managing those invasive species. Arising out of that direction were a couple of other weeds that I worked on, garlic mustard and teasel. And then the recognition of the commonality of traits in invasive plants, and eventually understanding that many of those traits of invasive weeds were the very ones that we were exploiting for growing biofuel crops. Finally, I moved to Arkansas. as a department head, which may be considered either an evolutionary reversion or a dead end to many. But nevertheless, I've been able to rekindle my interest in biological control of weeds, working on a rangeland weed, spotted knapweed, that has invaded the South. And I've been able to continue working on biofuel crops, thinking about the invasiveness of novel bioenergy crops, pest management needs that are going to be necessary as we deploy these even more, and modeling to support policy and planning decisions for bioenergy. So if you look at all of this, just as my string of nonlinear thoughts took me from watching my bird feeder to Middle Eastern geopolitics, so I've got a string of ideas that throughout my career here, a path marked by hunches, connections, serendipity, and mistakes. And if you think about it, from in the bottom left, predators in crops or in soybeans at Purdue, to at the upper right, energy policy at Arkansas, but still having a series of connections through all of these ideas. Or you might look at this and say, this looks like somebody with a very short attention span. And that's probably true. But the connectedness of those ideas, that thread that ran through all of these, I would say, is a result of the education that I received here as a grad student. Think about the context of the time that I was here, 1985 to 1990, as a grad student. And so those were the years of Reagan and Bush, Gene Cady, Bobby Knight, Space Shuttle Challenger. I was taking physiology from Pete, and he lectured about 2 hours after the Challenger explosion occurred. These were the years that Barbara Ehrenreich called in the title of her book, The Worst Years of Our Lives. But actually, I'd say these were probably the best years of my life, because I think my career directions and accomplishments were made possible by the graduate education, the outcome of ideas that originated, matured, gained strength, gained traction, and were expressed. Hunches, connectedness, serendipity, errors, not just making mistakes, but learning from them to form new ideas. And I want to use those four factors, hunches, connectedness, serendipity, and error, to offer some advice, wanted or not, to the current group of graduate students and the next generation of Purdue scholars. Hunches. Your ideas have an historical origin, whether you consider it a phylogenetic background or not. Many of those ideas begin with your advisor, but your hunches develop, simmer slowly, and mature. They have an ontogeny. You might think of that ontogeny as your gut feeling, so follow your instincts. Connections. Develop your networks and cultivate them. You all have connections. Use them. Share your ideas, and not just with those that are closest to you. Don't just talk to those people who believe the same things that you do, because you're not going to grow. You're not going to be prepared for the shift in how you think, what you think, or how you can apply your ideas. Serendipity. The reason I came to entomology was totally serendipitous. I was working with Carrie Ravenold on birds. I knew nothing about entomology. I didn't plan to be an entomologist. I won't say it wasn't wanting to be. I say that I didn't know a beetle from a butterfly, and John McDonald and Pat McCafferty can attest to that. Some of the faculty at Arkansas would say that's still true. But as I was looking for graduate programs, I happened to meet my next door neighbor, Mark Schauer, who was a grad student of Don Shooter's. And just the first time I met him, Mark told me about this new professor that was moving to the department from Florida, an ecologist named O'Neill. I was looking for a program. I came in and met Bob. I'll tell later the whole story about that if asked, but I acted on that opportunity. So my search, Mark's comment, and Bob's arrival represented a serendipitous event, a convergence that I was able to work on. If I have time at the end of the talk, maybe in questions, I'll tell another story about serendipity. Error. Don't be afraid of error. We can be too afraid of being wrong, and we need to avoid making mistakes at all costs. I've got a different opinion of error, and maybe it's because I've been so good at making them over the years, but my opinion is illustrated by two quotes. And I don't usually like to read slides, but I will read these quotes. So the first of these, from Stephen Johnson's book, error often creates a path that leads you out of your comfortable assumptions. Being right keeps you in place, being wrong forces you to explore. And the second, a few years before, the errors of the great mind exceed in number those in the less vigorous one. However, realize the corollary isn't following, that making a lot of errors doesn't necessarily ensure a great mind. We make a lot of, or we're often bound to be wrong in our business of doing science, and so be bold, take chances. Give yourself the opportunity to be wrong, because being wrong forces you to explore and to grow. It gives you a chance for your ideas to mature, the ontogeny of ideas, growing up. I have a favorite quote about growing up, and it's, when they tell you to grow up, they mean stop growing. I still ask myself every morning, what I want to be when I grow up. And I hope along the way I haven't stopped growing. So don't stop growing. Adapt. Take chances. Follow a new direction or learn something that may seem totally irrelevant. Because you need to educate yourself, and you're responsible for that education. And I think graduate education needs to be just that, education. Not training for a specific task, but broad education. Because we really never know when what we learn can be applied in a totally different context, the concept of acceptation. All too often, I think that education tends to narrow us rather than broaden us. And as students, we can easily fall into that trap. When I was a student, I didn't think I needed to know anything about parasitoids because I worked on predators in soybeans. I didn't think I needed to know anything about plant ecology or weed biocontrol because I worked on predators in soybeans. Fortunately, I had an advisor who did not feel the same way, and so I was forced to broaden. So be open, fight the tendency to narrow, which is always occurring. And if you think you know what you're going to be when you grow up, you're either wrong or you're thinking too narrowly. You're not giving yourself the benefit of all the opportunities that are out there. So don't stop growing. Don't underestimate the importance of serendipity. Be aware and open. Recall, serendipity is finding something when we're not looking for it. The internet, the web, gives us an opportunity for serendipity that's of a magnitude we never could have imagined. We've all done this. You look for one reference, it leads to another, and anymore it's much easier than it once was. Sometimes they're productive, sometimes you find that you're looking at something that has nothing to do with where you started. But without trying to sound too old-fashioned, when I did literature searches, and many of you that have hair somewhat the color of mine, these were linear searches. You looked for a reference, and it was a string, not a web. You went from one to the next to the next. And you didn't really branch out. It wasn't as easy to do, to find things. But the internet now allows us to do nonlinear searching by connecting ideas like a web, not by a string. I say once we browse the library, and now we browse the web. But when we looked in the library, we were looking at titles. We were looking even at the binding of books, whatever caught our attention. But we generally looked for a certain reference, we found it, and we left without considering what may have been nearby or on either side of that. So my example of serendipity was, and I've told Steve this story, searching for a reference when I was almost finished with my dissertation. I was looking for a reference that would bolster my argument about how predators could persist in a crop habitat, getting very little energy from scarce prey meals. I found the reference. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for. And so either on a whim, it's been 22 years, I don't remember, or maybe out of desperation, I pulled the volume next to the one I had just pulled off the shelf. And I looked through that. And what I found was a paper on minimizing water loss by mirids, the behavior that facultatively predaceous mirids that lived in harsh habitats, arid habitats, used. And so what they were doing was conserving water. And this gave me a mechanism for how to explain what I was trying to work on. Predators were not maximizing their gains, they were minimizing their losses, just as those insects did that were conserving water. Now, the example may seem antiquated, but there are a couple of points. The first of those, that I was following my hunches. The second, that I was open to ideas that were outside my boundaries. Think about it. What did mirids in the desert have to do with predatory stink bugs in soybeans? And the third was that I was still looking through the literature as I was completing my dissertation. The most literature searching doesn't stop when you give your committee your proposal or the chapter your literature review. So the most important reference I found was found 2 weeks before I gave my dissertation to my committee, 5 years after I started. I try to hammer this point in our students at Arkansas, mostly unsuccessfully, but I try to remind them that they need to keep looking. So we now use the web. Web browsing gives us nonlinear connections, the linkage connection in multidimensional ways. Pasteur, chance favors only the prepared mind, but in his book, Stephen Johnson said, chance favors the connected mind. So find ways to be connected. And while you're doing so, find ways to put yourself in a position to be able to make errors. Take a chance and learn from those errors. Bob and I spent a lot of time trying to fit what we saw into contemporary theory about predators. We recognized that we were wrong to be blindly accepting, or half blindly in Bob's case, the dogma that we were trying to apply to our system. It wasn't so much being wrong that helped, it was recognizing that we were wrong. So now the leap to try to connect this. As I said, you are responsible for your own education. As faculty and advisors, we need to give you space to learn and listen, to let you develop your ideas and connections, and to make mistakes. Not just to parrot or simply refine slightly our own ideas, but learn how to approach a problem and apply knowledge in new areas, to develop your own ideas. And as you develop new ideas, you also need to find a way to discard old ideas. This quote from Georgia O'Keeffe, I think, illustrates that. As you get the chance to discard, you also need a chance to pick up anew. As students, you get a number of opportunities. Many of those are opportunities to speak, but you also need to make sure you cultivate the ability to listen to ideas, to learn to form connections between ideas and apply them in new contexts, to grow from learning to listen. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. It's not from the Bhagavad Gita, it's not from Confucius, not from Machiavelli, not from Descartes. A little more recent source, Jimi Hendrix. Well, you've seen I use a lot of quotes, which can either be interpreted as somebody who reads very broadly or someone who's never had an original idea. Again, your choice. But I'm enamored of many of the quotes attributed to Einstein, especially those that I think are spot on for how I view education. I'm not going to read these. Many of these are ones that you know. Some of them I think are absolutely right for education. Probably the most important one, a miracle that curiosity survives. I'm an educator and I believe this. So I'm the beneficiary of an education at Purdue that provided me opportunities to speak, to learn, to listen, to question, and still to retain my curiosity. In the 100 years of Purdue Entomology, this department has given students those opportunities and that collection of skills. I'm the beneficiary of a series of ideas, and I had the benefit of the serendipity of finding in Bob O'Neill an advisor who prepared me with those acceptations that allowed a career with academic leaps and new directions. I'll forever be grateful for the phylogenetic base that he provided me in ideas and the space for the ontogeny or development of those ideas. Bob was my advisor and mentor, but even more, he was my friend. I'm grateful for all the years that I spent here, for the context and opportunities that this department provided, the connections made, the serendipity, and the error, I would say the chance to succeed. So in closing, the two words you've waited 32 minutes to hear, I conclude with one final quote. Not Stephen Johnson, not Albert Einstein, Georgia O'Keeffe, but that person who signed the Morrill Act 150 years ago. And in Lincoln's farewell address, his line that I think epitomizes how I feel about my education here. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. So thank you for your patience in listening to my attempt to connect ideas. And thank you for this honor, being connected with one more great idea that emanated from this department, that is the award honoring Dr. Osmun, connecting him and his legacy to the graduates of this department. Thank you very much.